Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. This hour, we're going to spend some time talking about social media. A couple of good reasons for that. First of all, it is a topic that we've addressed often here on Point of View. But I might also mention that we have a new booklet out, which is entitled A Biblical View on Social Media. And I'm going to kind of divide our hour into two parts. The first is, what is the influence of the media in general, and in particular social media? And then get into the issue of social media censorship, which has become a big issue, and will not only document what has been taking place, but also talk about what possible solutions there might be. And so I might just suggest, even as an action item, that if you aren't already subscribing to our Outlook magazine, we have issues that have addressed some of this in the past and will address it in the future. If you'd like to get a copy of this booklet, it's available to you as well, and you can just simply call us or contact us, Post Office Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, or leave a message at pointofview.net. And so those are just a couple of ideas on how you can educate yourself about this issue. And in particular, if you are wanting to share some of this material with your children, maybe because you want to have some limits on their social media, maybe you'd like to share it with people in the church. Of course, there's a podcast that's available and a variety of other resources. So I would encourage you to take advantage of what we make available so often here at Point of View. Before I get into the influence of social media in particular, let's for just a minute talk about the influence of media in general. And as I've spoken about this, there's probably a lot of ways to make the case, but probably the simplest way to make the case is to simply look at an article that appeared years ago in Christianity Today by George Barna, in which he was looking at what are oftentimes referred to as the sources of significant influence. And these SSIs, as they are called, help us understand, who, in a sense, sets the agenda for our culture and where do we see the greatest influence taking place. And so he concluded that the primary sources of social influence and significant influence in our society today come from movies, television, the internet, books, music, public policy and law, and family. Now, interestingly enough, this was done largely before we had a lot more social media, so I suspect that the internet might even become number one, simply because not only are people on the internet on their computers, they're on the internet on their phones. But the point I'm making is that if you look at that list, you recognize that the first five have something in common. They're all the media. And so this is, I think, an illustration of something I think we already sort of intuitively know, but we can now document with some level of precision. And that is, the media has become primarily a socializer of our society in general and our children in particular. Matter of fact, there have been some very significant studies done by the Kaiser Family Foundation looking at the media usage of young people ages 8 to 18. And one of the things you notice is they update this about every 5 years. And every time they update it, the number of hours of media usage go up at least another hour. So from 7.5 hours to 8.5 hours to almost 11 hours to now even further. And since a lot of those studies were really developed back in the 1990s and then into the 21st century, you can see the remarkable growth in terms of the influence of television, of computers, even of music, because once you have the iPod and the iPad and the iPhone and things like that, music. And so almost every aspect of media usage increased dramatically during that period of time. And there was only one exception. Reading has gone down. And so, again, when you talk about electronic media, it has had a profound impact in our society. Well, as we get into some of the issues associated with media, it's probably worth mentioning just for a minute that obviously we don't have any Bible verses which talk about social media or iTunes or Instagram or Facebook, but they do give us some general principles and standards, and one of those certainly is the idea that we should really flee from those things which are going to be detrimental to our Christian life. The Apostle Paul, when he writes perhaps his last letter to Timothy in 2 Timothy 2:22, says, "Flee from youthful lust," and goes on to say that pursue righteousness, faith, love, and peace. You can go into Colossians 3:8, which where Paul says, we should rid ourselves of such things as anger and rage and malice and slander and filthy language from our lips. So if we're going to want to pay attention to what comes into our eye gate and our ear gate, how do we do that? And of course, he gives us a very clear indication of that in Philippians 4:8, when he says, "Finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things." And so again, we have quite a bit of evidence to suggest that we should be people that have a level of discernment. And one of the things we talk about so often when we talk about media is the need for discernment. We can, for example, recognize that when you're talking about movies and television, but even YouTube videos and a variety of other things, you can see that the media oftentimes presents an unreal view of the world. You have predictable plots, one-dimensional characters. In some respects, life is much more complicated than that. Some of these situation comedies, all the problems are resolved within a 30-minute situation comedy. Doesn't happen that way in life. It also presents, as I think you could also see, this idea of an oversimplified view of the world in which all sorts of difficulties are easily eradicated. But perhaps the greatest concern is, especially when we talk about this area of social media, the media desensitizes its viewers. Now, there used to be a time not so long ago that if you wanted to watch a movie, especially those of you that are listening to this or older, you'd have to go to a movie theater. Well, now, of course, you can get those movies. They come to your home. Originally, they were through things like videotapes and DVDs, but now, of course, you have streaming. And young people watching movies all the time and watching video all the time on their computers and on their smartphones. And so, in a result, this issue of desensitization has become perhaps greater than ever before. And so, when we come back from the break, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about what we've learned about the influence of social media. If you see me trying to say that indeed there is no reason that you should have access to these digital devices, that's not what I'm arguing for. If you think I'm arguing that you get rid of your computers and your telephone, your television, your phonograph records and all that kind of stuff, no. But we are recognizing that a wise and discerning Christian is going to want to develop some levels of discernment and maybe some boundaries. So we're going to talk about how are these digital devices affecting the way we perceive the world. We've learned a lot more just in the last few years, and I'll share that with you right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
I had Professor Robert George of Princeton University on my radio program recently to talk about the dialogue he had for a number of years with Professor Cornel West. They certainly qualify as the odd couple given their differences in political perspectives and their different racial backgrounds, but they have forged a partnership based upon mutual respect and a desire for civil dialogue. Months ago, they published an op-ed that was really a summary of their common commitments. They reminded us that to unite the country, we need honesty and courage. And here are 4 of their many aphorisms in that article. First, they said we need the honesty and courage to speak the truth, including painful truths that unsettle not only our foes, but also our friends and most especially ourselves. Number 2, we need the honesty and courage to recognize the faults, flaws, and failings of even the greatest of our heroes and to acknowledge our own faults, flaws, and failings. Number 3, we need the honesty and courage to express dissent, to say, no, I will not go along when conscience tells us that our own ideological or political tribe has gone astray, or gone too far, or become fanatical, or blind to integrity and the dignity of all. And number 4, we need the honesty and courage not to compromise our beliefs, or to go silent on them out of a desire to be accepted, or out of a fear of being ostracized, excluded, or canceled. You know, America is a divided country, and we need to work to end this polarization. That's why I think these wise statements provide a foundation to do just that. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Talking about social media today, and again, let me encourage you to get a free copy of my book on social media. It's actually a booklet, I should say, and it's available through Point of View, although I do have a book that I'm also going to be reading from Arts, Media, and Culture. Now, of course, since the publisher charges us, we have to charge you, but for the booklet, if you'd like to get a copy, feel free to contact us. But in my chapter on the new media and society, I quote from Rachel Marsden, who, writing in the Wall Street Journal, kind of wanted to set aside this idea that all this technology is going to make our kids smarter. I think, as you're going to find out this section of our discussion, it might actually do more harm than good sometimes. But Rachel Marsden puts it this way: spare me the stories of your genius, tech-savvy child who can name every country on Google Earth, or how because of your iPhone, BlackBerry, or 3 cell phones, you juggle 20 tasks at once and never miss any business, even at 4 a.m., because you sleep with your portable devices. Does anyone care that technology is destroying social graces and turning people into rude jerks? Thought that was kind of interesting. And that was written a couple of years ago because obviously we've updated some of that as well. But there has been this ongoing concern about even the impact that some of this might be having on our families and our children. And one of the people that we've interviewed on this program on Point of View a number of occasions is Rebecca Hagelin. And she has talked about the fact that narcissism has sort of picked up and actually begun to creep into our world. And so she's also written about this as well in an article that was talking about this, said young people spend hours every day updating their Facebook pages, post and email countless pictures of themselves, plug their ears with music to create a self-indulgent experience shut off from everyone around them. So those are just a few of the warnings before we get into some of the things we talk about in this booklet on social media, because we all have the sense that it might be a little bit excessive in terms of the amount of time that sometimes young people and even adults spend in that regard. But let's, if we can, go into a little more of the actual studies that have been done. And before I get into the heavy studies, let me just start by saying that one of the interesting ways to get into this conversation is to look at some of the material put together by Nicholas Carr. He began to wonder whether or not social media was having a profound negative effect even on himself. And so he wrote an article in Atlantic entitled, "Is Google Making Us Stupid?" And he said, "I observed over the past few years that I've had an uncomfortable sense that someone or something has been tinkering with my brain, remapping the neural circuitry, reprogramming the memory." And he believed this came from using the internet. And of course, he used the word Google, but he could have said Twitter, Facebook, anything else. But that's what he did when he wrote that article in Atlantic. That particular article connected with so many people that he then went on to continue his research and produced a book, which is entitled The Shallows: What the Internet is Doing to Our Brains. And what he does in the book, and it's one that actually Nick Pitts and I have quoted from on a regular basis, he took the time to survey a lot of the brain research that has helped us to understand why we don't read as much as we used to and why it seems to be harder for us to concentrate. And a lot of that gets down to a word that I've used on this program before, but it's worth repeating, and that is the brain reprograms itself. It is using what's called neuroplasticity. Now, that's a good thing. I mean, if you have a stroke in one part of your brain, you have an injury in one part of your brain, it's amazing that our just phenomenal brain structures are able to remap themselves sometimes in pretty significant ways, develop other neural connections. And so this can be a very positive thing, but it also is a negative in the sense that these digital devices perhaps are actually remapping our brain, because if you use it, you'll keep it, but if you don't use it, you'll lose it. And so one of the things he says is that also we have difficulty concentrating because we sort of programmed our brains to only pay attention for a short period of time. One of his quotes is, "Once I was a scuba diver in a sea of words. Now I zip along the surface like a guy on a jet ski." And one of the other quotes that I put in this book comes from one of the developmental psychologists at Tufts University. Said, "We are not only what we read, we're how we read." And that is the style of reading that we've developed with our iPhones, our iPads, our computers, going to various sites like Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, as well as using Google. In some respects, put an emphasis on efficiency and immediacy. And so as a result, it sort of changed the way we read and changed the way we actually acquire information. And as I said, we know a little bit more about this now because you have these incredible brains. In some respects, we've said that one of the most really complex organs in the universe is right between your ears, 100 billion neurons inside your skull. They can break connections, they can form connections, and the argument has been, well, this has only happened to young people. You can't teach an old dog new tricks. Hate to tell you, that's not the case. It's even reprogramming, if you will, the brains of adults. One neuroscientist at George Mason University said the brain has the ability to reprogram itself on the fly, altering the way it functions. And so let's, if we can, talk about a couple of issues before we take a break. One is the issue of concentration. In the booklet, I quote from Stephen Kotler. He wrote a very helpful article and a little bit concerning article in Psychology Today, and he used the same kind of phraseology. His was, How Twitter Makes You Stupid. Because he said he once asked the author of a best-selling book why he called it the 8-minute meditation. And the author told him, well, because 8 minutes is the length of an average segment in television, and he reasoned that most of us can only maybe pay attention for 8 minutes. Well, Stephen Kotler took that to its extreme and said, if that's the case, by reading more and more Twitter posts, this is back when Twitter was 140 characters, he said could be reducing our time of concentration to 140 words or 140 characters. And so the point he's making is that he even concluded that if you took a Twitter-addicted teen and gave them a reading comprehension test, their comprehension levels would plunge once they passed the 140-word mark. So this is, again, just one of those issues of concentration. And so people oftentimes convince themselves that they can multitask. But in the book, I also point out something very interesting, and that is you really are not multitasking. We now, through various kinds of brain studies, recognize that what you are actually engaged in is what psychologists and neurophysiologists call continuous partial attention. And so you have all probably at one time or another been in a room where somebody's supposedly listening to you or in a meeting, but they're paying attention to their digital device. And they'll say, oh, I'm multitasking. No, they're just jumping back and forth between what they think they're concentrating on. And because we've done so many brain scans and maps, we recognize that a person is kidding themselves to really think that they are multitasking. One of the last things we talk about in here is also this issue of addiction. And just before we take a break, let me just mention that that is something which we can very easily document just by our own experience. Take a digital device away from your teenagers right now and watch them go into withdrawal. And I've told the story on this program before, but it's worth mentioning again that one of my colleagues who's written some of these books on technology actually has taught a course in technology for a number of years at the University of Texas at Dallas. And what he has found is that these students are so addicted that when he has this one requirement in the class for you to have, if you will, a digital fast, which means you get to hand over your smartphone to him. He puts it in a drawer for 2 days. There, first of all, are a lot of students that will not do it because they can't even imagine spending more than an hour away from their phone, much less 2 days without their phone. And then for those that do, by the time they come in on that second day, they're almost sweating because they just cannot even imagine what it would be like to have to go any longer without that smartphone. And if those aren't signs of addiction, I don't know what is. And George Barna has a very good article that came out a number of years ago about smartphone addiction, in which he said if you look at the criteria for addiction of various substances and see the characteristics, you see the same kind of phenomenon for people in social media. So when we come back, I'm going to have a couple other quick comments about the impact of social media. Then we're going to move into this whole issue of social media censorship. All that coming up right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kirby Anderson.
Back once again talking about social media for a number of reasons. First of all, it's something that affects you day to day. It certainly affects your children and grandchildren. I want to give you some facts and figures and information. This booklet on social media is available to you. And one of the things that I think you've already learned from our discussion is just to pay attention to the amount of time that you spend in front of digital devices, whether you're an adult or a child. And again, I quoted a while back from the individual that wrote the book, What the Internet is Doing to Our Brains, Nicholas Carr. At one point he says, it reminded him of the 2001 Space Odyssey, where they begin to disconnect the memory circuits of that runaway computer, Hal. And Hal says at one point, Dave, my mind is going. I can feel it. I can feel it. And interesting enough, Nicholas Carr says the same thing. I can feel it, too. Over the past few years, I've had an uncomfortable sense that someone or something has been tinkering with my brain, remapping the neural circuitry, reprogramming the memory. And so, again, this is one of the reasons why, from a Christian point of view, I think we should really make sure that we're not being conformed to this world, which is a warning that Paul gives to us in Romans 12:2, and that we should not be taken captive by false philosophies, another warning that Paul gives us in Colossians 2:8, but instead we should focus on those things which are true and honorable and just and pure and lovely, commendable, excellent, worthy of praise, as we see in Philippians 4:8. But that brings us to the whole issue of social media censorship, and this is not a new topic for those of us on Point of View. You might remember many years ago, Craig Parshall, who at that time was the vice president of the National Religious Broadcasters, who actually began what was called the John Milton Project for Religious Free Speech. He was more recently on the program with us saying that he's even revived some of that because they had been monitoring what was happening. And back then, they were talking about free speech, liberty of citizens who use the internet is nearing a crisis point. Well, back then, the stories were not that difficult. They had to do with, for example, Governor Mike Huckabee called for a Chick-fil-A Appreciation Day, and Facebook took it down, but then got a little bit too much controversy, so they put it back up. There were an occasional YouTube video on abortion that was taken down. Lila Rose, probably the one that was affected by that most. But more recently, talk about affecting videos. Dennis Prager's PragerU has at least, I think it's about half of the videos. These are 5-minute videos that maybe aren't taken down, but they're put in a restricted area. And so that is the case. Of course, we years ago talked about how Apple took down the iPhone app for the Manhattan Declaration only because it talked about life and marriage, and that was seen as bad. But now you can see how there has been even much more monitoring of some of those actions. So if you would like to find a previous issue of Outlook magazine, that one came out June of last year, June of 2018. And in there, we talk about some of the testimony at that time by Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg, which I thought was kind of interesting because most of the testimony had to do with data collection and privacy. But to the credit of at least 2 U.S. senators, they raised a few other things. First of all, Senator Ted Cruz raised very good questions back then about a pervasive pattern of bias and political censorship. And in just a minute, I'm going to quote from a more recent Senate hearing in that regard. And Senator Ben Sasse also raised the question about whether America might be better off not being policed by one company that has a really big and powerful platform. So we talked about some of that a year ago, and let me now kind of update that because in a recent Senate hearing, you had Senator Marsha Blackburn, who's a senator from Tennessee, who said during her 2018 campaign, they pulled one of her particular ads because it had a pro-life theme, and Twitter deemed it as inflammatory. Now, to be fair, when the representative from Twitter was there, he did apologize to her and said they had made a mistake on your ad. But then shortly thereafter, you have Senator Ted Cruz had this big poster. You can see this on some of the web pages that have been posted on this. It was an ad done by our friends at Susan B. Anthony, and it showed a picture of Mother Teresa, and then across it he had the word censored because they used a quote from Mother Teresa about the fact that abortion is anti-woman. So you've had some of those kinds of things. Then, of course, you had various commentators that have been banned from Facebook, and many of those are individuals that quite frankly, we don't have on this program. We don't necessarily agree with them. They may be a little too extreme. They might travel and deal with conspiracies that we don't necessarily think are wise. But when you start pulling out people that almost all of us would have some problems with, it makes it a lot easier to pull out others like us from Facebook. You've had others like Steven Crowder's YouTube channel, which has been demonetized, and others are starting to do that. And as I said, about 24 PragerU videos have been slapped with this restrictive label. So it takes only a little bit of time to see how dangerous this might be. So the point I'm making, and the point we make in this particular article on big tech censorship is that these individuals are fairly powerful. And if you don't believe that, one of the studies that came out the other day, and I have every reason to believe it, shows that Google controls about 90% of the internet searches worldwide. Now, your argument could be, well, there's no non-economic reason why you couldn't start an alternative to Google, and there's Bing and a variety of others that are out there, but, this is where all the players are. When you look at some of the internet searches, the smartphone operating systems, the desktop browsers, where digital advertising is, it tends to pretty much land at Google, Facebook, Twitter, as well as Instagram, YouTube. Those kind of are the big tech people. And Senator Ted Cruz in that hearing pointed out the fact that these big tech companies, to use his phrase, is, quote, are larger and more powerful than Standard Oil was when it was broken up. And they are larger and more powerful than AT&T was when it was broken up. But that doesn't necessarily mean that government needs to step in. But nevertheless, that is part of the issue. There are some that have argued, I don't agree with them necessarily, that platform access is a civil right. And if you want to make that a civil right, well, we recognize what a civil right is, and that is you cannot inhibit that. But again, these private companies are oftentimes trying to portray themselves as like an individual that's providing a platform in a public park. That is, I really don't control the content. I'm giving anybody a chance to say anything they want. There may be some limits in terms of you don't want people calling for the overthrow of the government. You don't want people shouting obscenities or things or doing obscene kinds of things. But by and large, the argument is that they're a public platform. But those that are arguing that platform access is a civil right are saying these are monopolies and they need to be broken up. But the problem with that argument is that Facebook and Twitter and YouTube are private property. And so as a result, they do not necessarily always, like the federal government, have to be governed by the First Amendment. If you are indeed a private company like the Washington Post or the New York Times doesn't have to give you a right to post your op-ed on their page. Even if you write a letter to the editor, they don't have to post your letter to the editor on the newspaper because they are what? A private company. But when we come back from the break, I want to talk about where that gets a little bit more difficult, because if indeed they're a public square, then they also seem to be censoring certain individuals and really paying attention to the content of certain individuals. And yet at the same time, they're being treated from a legal and political point of view as if they're a public square. And that goes back to something I'll talk about after the break, the 1996 Communications Decency Act, and what could or should happen in terms of that. So again, we're talking today about a biblical point of view on social media. We spent most of our first half of this discussion on the influence of the media. Now I want to talk a little bit more about social media censorship and what government can do and what we as individuals should do in terms of expressing our opinions in that regard. And so we will continue to, of course, monitor this at Point of View, but at the same time, we want to educate you about some of the issues that are on the table in terms of social media censorship. So let's take a break, and when we come back, we will continue our conversation. And again, if you want some more information, you can find some of it, of course, on our website, pointofview.net, but we also have it in this little booklet on social media. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you would like to know a little bit more about this topic, again, we are making available this booklet on social media. But let's again talk about this idea of social media censorship. And the first issue, as we pointed out, is a lot of these so-called big tech companies. We're talking about Google and Facebook and Twitter and YouTube and others are private companies. And so private companies certainly are governed in a much different way than, say, a publicly held company. And so if you want to publish something or not publish something, you have that freedom. And more importantly, you also are held responsible for what an individual publishes. In other words, if indeed you're just an open forum, a good example is a free speech platform in a public park. If later you disagree with something that is said, or somebody says something libelous or slanderous from that platform, you can't sue the city or the park. They didn't know what the person was going to say. It's a public arena. They can say whatever they want. They can be sued, but you can't sue the individual that provided the platform. And that's been the argument of Facebook and Twitter and Google and YouTube and those, because they're saying we're just providing a platform. But that's not exactly true, as we've just pointed out. They are also looking at and evaluating content. And now we have the Veritas Forum videos that are showing to us as well that some of the individuals in these companies are wanting to do what they can not only to advance certain ideas, but even advance certain candidates, including presidential candidates. Which brings us back to a decision that was made during the Clinton administration, which I agreed with at the time. I think I still agree with it, but it's something to think about, and that is the 1996 Communications Decency Act actually has a section in there that actually protects these platforms from any kind of liability, because they recognize that this would be crippling to the advancement of the internet, and the internet has done very well because it's been protected up until now in those regards. And so there are some individuals that are saying maybe we should withdraw that particular section of the Communications Decency Act. Maybe we should encourage government to take a closer look. This is why a lot of us around the table are a little bit wary of that, because once you have the government being empowered to patrol social media platforms, it reminds us a little bit of another very important piece of legislation that was eventually removed, but one that really, in some cases, tended to do more harm than good. And that was the 1949 FCC Fairness Doctrine. It was something that ostensibly was to force media outlets to provide content that was fair, that it was honest, it was balanced. But the bottom line is oftentimes what it did was tend to stifle those ideas. And frankly, talk radio and other forms of media exploded once first the FCC Fairness Doctrine was ignored and eventually under the Reagan administration was removed. And so in some respects, that's why people, including some of us around the table, oftentimes have a little bit of a question about whether or not the government should step in as well. Another aspect of that I talk about in the booklet is even if the government were to regulate content on social media platforms, I think it's worth mentioning, as I say in here, that some of those companies would probably have a lot of influence. Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg, don't you think they'd probably have a place at the table in terms of how the government drafts various kinds of media regulations? And it could be done in such a way that it actually gives even more of a competitive advantage to things like Facebook and Twitter and a variety of other social media platforms. So that's another reason why it's certainly of concern. And so some have suggested we might even talk about closing down our social media accounts, because the argument, I think legitimately, if you don't like the way the New York Times or the Washington Post report stories, you don't have to subscribe to those newspapers. If you don't like how either MSNBC or Fox News or anybody covers stories, you don't have to tune into that TV network. And so in some respects, those kinds of choices are being made as well. So one individual in particular said, delete your Facebook yesterday. Don't get your news from Twitter. The issues of free speech on social media will no longer matter to you. They don't matter to me. I've made a decision not to subjugate myself to the whims of our new overlords. And that kind of brings us back to a point I made earlier, and that is this issue of media addiction. Whether you decide to close down your media account or not, whether you want to keep your social media account or not have it, it seems to me that all of us, whether we're adults or children, need to recognize this real concern about what we call media addiction. George Barna, as I mentioned earlier, concluded that media exposure has become America's most widespread and serious addiction. And I remember when he first posted that, I thought, yeah, everything's an addiction. But he really convinced me in the article, because he says if you go back and look at the criteria that is used to evaluate whether somebody is addicted, or those criteria that have been established by the American Psychiatric Association, you can see that fits pretty well. And we also have documented in this hour that addictions could change your brain structure, can alter your emotions, your motivations, and your concentration. Oh, does that just sound like what we just talked about in terms of social media? Yes, it does. It's not as serious as what LSD or cocaine or marijuana might do, but I think, again, you can recognize that some of these characteristics are the case. And more importantly, if nothing else, as we wind down this particular hour, I just want to especially have those of us that are parents and grandparents pay attention to this digital generation. Those young people that were growing up in the media generation, that would be the so-called Generation Y, or oftentimes called millennials, certainly entered into a time of media. But the next generation, the so-called Generation Z, those are oftentimes referred to as the iGen generation, they're digital natives. They grew up with digital devices. At 2 years old, they might have had an iPad on their laps to play games. And so in some respects, this is, I think, all the more reason for us to begin to reevaluate how many hours a week young people, especially very young people, spend in terms of media. And it's interesting, George Barna points out that about 3/4 of parents say that exposure of their children to inappropriate media content is one of their top concerns. But if you go back and ask the question, well, how do they have access to that media? You're the one that turned on the TV set. You're the one that gave them a digital device. You're the one that gave them video games. Maybe you're the one that should be paying attention to this as well. And one final point, for those of you that are in church ministry, I just hope that there would be a time in which you, if you're a pastor, a Sunday school leader, a Bible fellowship leader, or somebody like that, that you would just simply take the time to maybe address this issue as well. And again, if you want some of the resources, my book, Arts, Media, and Culture, we have one on technology and social trends. And of course, this free booklet we are making available, Biblical View on Social Media, is something that we would want to put in your hands so that maybe you could get others in your sphere of influence, your congregation, your small group, or just merely your family, to begin to think about how to apply biblical principles to this. So anyway, as we wind down our discussion of social media, let me one more time encourage you to get a copy of this book on social media. You can contact us at www.pointofview.net, or you can write to us. The address is simple, Post Office Box 30, Dallas, Texas, 75221. Well, thank you for listening to this hour-long discussion right here on Point of View on social media.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. This hour, we're going to spend some time really looking at nations, civilizations, and even those worldviews through history, because we have available at Point of View a number of booklets. One that is out, A Biblical View on Civilization Decline. And in some respects, I did it because we had produced an earlier booklet, which we'll talk about a little bit later this hour, Worldviews Through History, because this particular booklet that came out kind of focused on the fact that we start with kind of this Roman worldview, go through kind of the pagan world, then see the influence of Christianity leading us to the 21st century. And yet, interestingly enough, in many ways, our world in the 21st century is a lot like the first century. But in doing that, it sort of led to the obvious question, and that is, if Rome was such a, really, if you will, stable empire, what led to its decline? And if you want to broaden that a little bit and say, you know, we see the rise and fall of great civilizations. You think of the Egyptians, the Romans, the Greeks. You can think of the Persians, the Babylonians. I mean, the list is a pretty long list. And then you have some civilizations that lasted for a relatively short period of time, the Etruscans, the Phoenicians, and others. And then, of course, if you've read the Old Testament, you sort of see the rise and fall of Israel itself. So what I want to try to do is for a few minutes to really try to look at, why do civilizations rise, and most importantly, why do they decline? And this is something that has been the study of historians through many centuries, and it has been something that people have written not only whole books, but whole book series on. So this is going to be obviously a shorter look. But the goal here is to recognize that there are some reasons for the decline in a civilization, and some of those seem to be eluding some of our secular historians. One of the things I'll be talking about this hour is family decline. If you think about it, a civilization, a nation, a society is really based upon the family. So if the family falls apart, sooner or later, the nation is going to fall apart. Then we have the whole issue of spiritual decline. I don't think you can really understand Romans 1, that the Apostle Paul is writing to the church in Rome, without his analysis, which I think is a very keen analysis of what was happening in the Hellenistic Greek world. So I want to try to not only add to, but even change some of the focus on the decline of a civilization. Then we're going to come back and talk about some of these worldviews. And so these are booklets that are available through Point of View. And if you find yourself saying, I'd like to read a little bit more, or as we always do at the very back of these booklets, we have additional resources. So we point you to other books and other resources that you would find helpful. I hope that you will do so. But again, let's, if we can, first of all, recognize that we're going to be talking about history. And really, to answer this question about civilization decline, we have to study history. And that, of course, is the first problem we can put on the table, because historians come to very different conclusions about why certain events take place and what led to the decline and fall of a civilization. Certainly, economic challenges are part of that, and your Marxist historians are going to view a lot of history through the economic lens. If you go back and look at the history books that were written, say, in the 19th century, before some of these Marxist ideas made their way into the university, you're going to get a very different view of, for example, the American Revolution than you do now. Because once the economic analysis began to be rooted into the view of history, you probably have heard that the reason we had an American Revolution is because taxation without representation. I would suggest that what you need to do is go back and look at the Declaration of Independence and recognize that that's just one of about 24 different reasons that were given by the founders, and it really isn't the most significant. But it is an economic reason, so that was the one that surfaced early on in some of the 20th century books trying to even explain something as simple as the American Revolution. Likewise, there are a lot of people that will say, well, the reason Rome fell is because the economy failed. Well, yes, but the barbarians that were at the gate were able to destroy Rome because the desire to defend the republic and later the monarchy pretty much faded away. And so we can also talk about things like social decline and political turmoil that also lead to this as well. But the biggest issue is that even if we do try to learn from history, oftentimes, sadly, we don't learn from history. Some of the quotes I put in the booklet, I think, are very illustrative. George Santayana lamented that those who forget the past are condemned to repeat it. The philosopher, George Hegel, said, what experience and history teach us is this, that people and governments never have learned anything from history or acted on principles deduced from it. Or, probably the famous quote from Winston Churchill, one thing we have learned from history is we haven't learned from history. One thing we can at least agree on is this. If you look at the great civilizations that have ever existed, the median age or the average age is about 200 years. So you have countries that are in existence today, like Great Britain, that exceed that age. And you have countries like the United States that are kind of at middle age. And so what we see are a number of these great civilizations oftentimes go through stages of birth to decline to death. And you may have, if you've been out on Facebook, seen something that has been attributed to a 19th century historian, in which he said that basically we oftentimes move from bondage to spiritual faith, from spiritual faith to great courage, from great courage to liberty, and then from liberty to abundance. But then things began to decline because now it changes from abundance to selfishness, from selfishness to complacency, from complacency to apathy, from apathy to moral decay, from moral decay to dependence, and finally from dependence to bondage. So when we come back from the break, I'll talk about that because what you see, very interestingly, is a movement from bondage to liberty. Many of these civilizations actually came about because of a revolution, came about because of a war or something of that nature. And so as a result, that first generation oftentimes throws off the shackles of bondage, and then the engines of commerce begin to develop, and it begins to be the great golden age of that republic or of that monarchy. But in its success are sown the very seeds of its failure, because the next generation, taking for granted their freedom, their liberty, their affluence, that leads oftentimes to apathy, indifference, and oftentimes even eventually heading back into slavery and bondage. So it's an interesting kind of cycle that we've seen, and there have been times in which those have been interrupted, but there have also been times when those have been almost the iron law of history. So when we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about that, and then move into, okay, if society is based on the family, is some of that due to family decline? I think it is, and we'll talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
I had Professor Robert George of Princeton University on my radio program recently to talk about the dialogue he had for a number of years with Professor Cornel West. They certainly qualify as the odd couple given their differences in political perspectives and their different racial backgrounds, but they have forged a partnership based upon mutual respect and a desire for civil dialogue. Months ago, they published an op-ed that was really a summary of their common commitments. They reminded us that to unite the country, we need honesty and courage. And here are 4 of their many aphorisms in that article. First, they said we need the honesty and courage to speak the truth, including painful truths that unsettle not only our foes, but also our friends and most especially ourselves. Number 2, we need the honesty and courage to recognize the faults, flaws, and failings of even the greatest of our heroes and to acknowledge our own faults, flaws, and failings. Number 3, we need the honesty and courage to express dissent, to say, no, I will not go along when conscience tells us that our own ideological or political tribe has gone astray or gone too far or become fanatical or blind to integrity and the dignity of all. And number 4, we need the honesty and courage not to compromise our beliefs or to go silent on them out of a desire to be accepted or out of a fear of being ostracized, excluded, or canceled. You know, America is a divided country, and we need to work to end this polarization. That's why I think these wise statements provide a foundation to do just that. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again talking about a biblical view on civilization decline. And as I mentioned just a minute ago, you've probably seen this idea of a nation going from bondage to spiritual faith and courage and liberty and abundance, but then oftentimes in its success are sown the very seeds of its failure because the next generation, taking for granted that abundance and that liberty, begins to be selfish, complacent, apathetic, and eventually you have moral decay setting in. And so even though I agree that those particular stages take place, I also think that as a Christian, we can see how a revival can change everything. For example, a lot of people believe that America was beginning to already become very decadent, even before the American Revolution, and we had then the first Great Awakening, Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield. And so that, I think, kind of turned the nation around. Many people say we might not have had an American Revolution without it. After the Revolution, again, you had kind of a complacency, and then we had a second American Revolution, kind of a second Great Awakening, kind of a revolution in the social area, in which a lot of those people in the second Great Awakening were abolitionists and temperance movement, a variety of other things, and all sorts of great ministries developed there. And even if you look at the Old Testament, a good example is the book of Jonah. I mean, I think you could make the case that really destruction was coming to Nineveh. God sends Jonah to Nineveh, except he takes a really significant detour. But when he does show up, we do know from secular history that a revival of sorts, a spiritual revival, took place. And even though Nineveh was headed towards destruction, We know that it's survived another century. So the point I'm making is that we don't want to call this always an iron law of history. Sometimes a spiritual revival can turn the nation around. And that brings me to the second key point in my booklet on civilization decline. Because historians that are at least open-minded to looking at some of the social and spiritual issues have noticed a very strong correlation between family decline and the decline of a nation. If you think about it, if a family is strong, in some respects, the family unit is a smaller unit of the nation. And so if the family is strong, the nation is strong. If the family falls apart, often it looks like the nation is headed for decline. Now, I'm not the first person to come up with that. A matter of fact, if you want to read some of the books in the back of our booklet, J.D. Unwin is a British historian who has looked at some of that, and it's fascinating because he's looked at this, what he calls sex in culture, and seen what happens when we don't control our sexual urges, and documents that. And then this Russian sociologist, Petrin Sorokin, The Crisis of Our Age, really began to study lots of civilizations that collapsed. And so you have even kind of more secular-minded historians that are saying this and have noticed this. But in this booklet, I quote from a Christian book written by Carl Wilson, which came out many years ago, Our Dance Has Turned to Death. And what he did was he simply looked at family decline in ancient Greece and in the Roman Empire. And then he talks about the various stages. And again, we don't say that every stage has to follow every other one. Sometimes spiritual renewal or revival will change that. But this seems to be sort of the decline, the, if you will, societal entropy in that direction. Okay. The first stage, he says, men ceased to lead their families in worship. Spiritual and moral development became secondary. Their view of God became naturalistic, mathematical, and mechanical. Now think about this, because he's not talking about what was happening in the nation of Israel or what even happened in various Christian communities. He's just talking about the fact that you had some kind of worship of the gods, Apollo, Zeus, whatever it might be, but then the spiritual dimension faded, which leads to the second stage, where men selfishly neglected care of their wives and children because they began to pursue material wealth and political power and military power. And of course, you've seen this in Greece and Rome. Then material values began to really dominate, and you can kind of see this idea that instead it was all about making money, and it wasn't about building up the family. Which leads to the third issue, and a lot of this now is borrowed from some of the material by J.D. Unwin, and that is the third stage is where you started seeing a change in the sexual values. As these individuals began to be financially successful, pursue political and military power, men who were preoccupied with business or war, first of all, they neglected their wives sexually, or in some cases, they began to be involved with lower-class women. Or let's also add to that, especially in Greece, but you also saw it in Rome, began to dabble in homosexuality. And so then you began to see this sort of double standard of morality taking place, where, yes, we're married, but it isn't out of love. It isn't even out of a commitment to the children. It's just sort of a societal contract. It's a social contract, but it's not really that meaningful, which, of course, then leads to the fourth stage, because that affects now the women. Because the role of women at home, the role of women and children at home, they lost value, they lost status. Women were neglected and their roles were devalued. Soon they revolted to gain access to material wealth and also to get freedom for sex outside of marriage. Women began to minimize the importance of sex in order to achieve children, and the emphasis was on, just sexual freedom. And even in many of those cases, both in Greece and Rome, marriage laws began to be loosened so that it made divorce easy. The fifth stage, you see husbands and wives competing with each other for money, house leadership, even for the affection of their children. Of course, you have then hostility and frustration. Even now, the development of homosexuality with the children because they don't have proper role models. A lot of these marriages end in separation and divorce Many of these children were unwanted. Of course, you have in Rome, many of them were aborted. They were abandoned if they weren't the child that you wanted. Sometimes they were molested. They were undisciplined. You had really gangs of undisciplined children roaming the streets in both Greece and Rome, leading to the sixth stage of where selfish individualism grows. It carries over into society. It fragments into smaller and smaller group loyalties. You sort of get almost, if you will, an identity politics. That's a modern phrase, but you see something like it back then. You have a substantial decrease in the birth rate. And so as a result, now you have an older population dependent on a younger population that is smaller than would be necessary for them to be supported. And finally, Carl Wilson says, unbelief in God becomes complete, parental authority is diminished, ethical and moral principles disappear, the economy and government begin to fall apart because now there's fragmentation, there's weakness, and even though you see eventually the barbarians at the gate, in a sense, that's the destruction of that particular republic because it's being held together simply by a dictator, but eventually the invading barbarians take over. And this is kind of the pattern that we've seen in Greece and Rome. But if you've heard me talking about Greece and Rome, you're thinking, sure sounds a little bit like what you're describing, what our world looks like today. Because after all, foundational to a nation are families. Families are the foundation of a nation. When the family crumbles, the nation falls because the nation is built on family unions. A nation will not be strong unless the family is strong. And I thought I'd end this segment by simply quoting from Michael Novak, social commentator. It's been years since we've had him on, but when he was alive, interestingly enough, he said in a very seminal essay about the family this. He said, one unforgettable law has been learned through all the disasters and injustices of the last 1,000 years. If things go well with the family, life is worth living. When the family falters, life falls apart. Okay, we're going to take a break, and just before we do so, let me just mention that we have a couple of these booklets that we are making available, and so I would encourage you to simply go to the website, pointofview.net. You'll find a lot of that, and if you'd like to listen to this again, of course, you know exactly what to do. You can go to the website, pointofview.net, click on the button that says Listen, and then you'll have a chance to hear some of the resources that we are making available and some of the conversation we've had here today. And, of course, it also is available to you by going to the YouTube channel. Let me also encourage you as we go to a break to join with us financially because, after all, we are dependent upon your financial gifts to bring this program to you. So you can click on that button that says Donate. And even a one-time gift would be greatly appreciated. But if you would want to join with us on a regular basis and join the Truth Team, we would love to hear from you. So, again, all of that is available at our website, pointofview.net. Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue looking at some of the trends in the decline of a civilization.
When you give to Point of View, does it make a difference? Jeremy Dies would tell you that it does. He grew up listening to Point of View in the back seat of his mom's car, and it helped to shape his thinking.
I had parents that were able to sit across from me at the dinner table after we listened to Marlon Maddox and Kirby Anderson years ago and think through what the scriptures say about these issues of current significance in our lives. That's only possible because Point of View has come along and ministered into my life and made me who I am today. And here I am today defending religious liberty, partly because Marlon Maddox and Penn Dexter and Kirby Anderson were the ones that were pushing me towards all that. They taught me how to think through these issues. They didn't tell me what to think. They taught me how to think.
Each gift you give will change lives. Not every Point of View listener will become a Jeremy, but if they listen for very long, they will be changed. And that will change how they impact and affect the lives of the people around them. So make that decision to change a life today. Join the Truth Team and boldly stand for truth in a world of lies, distortion, and information manipulation. Go to pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kirby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today as we talk about decline of a civilization, decline of a nation. And also, in just a few minutes, we'll also get into this booklet that we have on worldviews through history. Both are very important, and if you're just joining us, let me just mention that I've been talking about the importance of history. We've seen some of the stages that even secular historians have noticed in terms of the decline of a nation and decline of a civilization. Then just a few minutes ago, we talked about family decline because that's important as well. And you have British historians like J.D. Unwin and even the Russian sociologist Petrin Sorokin talking about this, but I quote from a very good book by Carl Wilson called Our Dance Has Turned to Death. And I thought now we would finish up this section by also recognizing that there are spiritual components. And my argument would be that if you've ever read Romans 1, and I'm sure you have, you've probably looked at it in terms of Paul addressing the church in Rome, and there's some great theological truths there. But it's also helpful to recognize that spiritual decline oftentimes leads to civilization decline. Often nations fall from within. Yeah, we see the barbarians at the gate and we say, well, they didn't have a strong enough military, and certainly weak nations are taken over by stronger nations. But I'm talking about some of these civilizations that were so very strong, but simply fell from within. And that is sort of the natural trajectory. It's sort of, if you will, the societal entropy, the decline that takes place, because so often what is happening is that if indeed you don't see yourself as important from a biblical point of view or from at least a spiritual point of view, even in these countries we've talked about that did not have the Bible, you still, if you believe in heaven, you believe in a God or gods, there's a tendency then to actually live for more than just yourself. And so oftentimes what happens is if there's a spiritual decline, or then you begin to see a moral decline, you see a moral weakness, and that oftentimes manifests itself even in a military weakness. And there are historians that have talked about how eventually in the Roman Empire there was less of a desire to defend the nation, to find other individuals, slaves, that would be actually put on the front lines to defend the nation, or mercenaries. And so as a result, they weren't the kind of fighting force that you would want if indeed the soldier on the front line is a person defending his own property, his own family. You can see how that would be much more motivating than a mercenary simply getting paid for it, or even a slave being put on the front lines to defend a country that he didn't really care about in the first place. So I think the idea is that spiritual decline sometimes leads to the decline of a nation. And I think we see that very clearly in Romans 1, as the Apostle Paul, writing to the church in Rome, is seeing the decline around him of the Hellenistic world of his time. So let's go through what we find in Romans 1. Because in the first stage, he talks about the fact that people turn from God to idolatry. Although God has revealed himself in nature to all individuals so that they are without excuse, a very clear reference there in Romans 1, they nevertheless tend to worship the creation rather than the Creator. And this, I think, is a biblical definition of idolatry. In the past, this took the form of actual idol worship. In our day, that may take the place in, maybe they don't have idols on their mantelpiece, but instead it's maybe the worship of money or the worship of self. But in either case, that's still idolatry. And a further example of that is maybe even the lack of thankfulness, because they're no longer grateful. They're no longer showing gratitude. Although they have been prospered by God, they're ungrateful. When they're no longer looking to God for wisdom and guidance, they become vain and futile and empty in their imaginations. And again, we see this in Romans 1. They no longer honor God, so in their foolish hearts they become darkened, and professing to be wise, they become fools. So that's stage number one. Stage number two is then when Paul talks about the fact that when men and women exchange their natural use of sex for unnatural uses. And here the Apostle Paul has these four very sobering words. God gave them over. In a society that has lust-driven sensuality and sexual perversion, where that begins to dominate, God gives them over to the degrading passions and unnatural desires. And that fits very much with what we were just talking about a few minutes ago in terms of how in some of these stages 2 and 3 in terms of family decline, you're spending more and more time in sexual debauchery. And either you can spend your emotions and your moral capital to build up the nation, or you can spend that same capital to actually go and enjoy the pleasures of sex and really, in a sense, tear down the nation. And so that, I think, is a very telling turn, because then it says God gave them over. Well, that leads to the third stage, and that's anarchy. Once a society has rejected God's revelation, it's really sort of on its own. Moral and social anarchy is the natural result, and at this point, God has given the sinners over to their depraved mind so that they do things that are not proper, as it says in Romans 1. And that results in a society that is without understanding, untrustworthy, unloving, and unmerciful. And so this, of course, describes exactly what you were seeing in the Roman Empire. And I think also illustrates why Christianity took hold, because while children were being abandoned, if somebody had a disease, they were put out on the streets, and the Christians, at the risk to their own lives, would try to nurse and help those individuals that had been abandoned. The Christians would go and adopt the children that had been abandoned in the streets, and this was striking. It was so different to anything that had been seen in that pagan worldview. So the first stage, of course, is this idea of turning from God. The second stage, about they begin to spend their passions on sexual immorality. The third stage, of course, leading to anarchy. And the final stage, as you might imagine, leads to judgment. That is, the judgment of God rightly falls on those who practice idolatry and immorality. And certainly, Paul's talking about an eternal judgment. After all, he's now going to write a number of other chapters in the book of Romans about what that means, and really begin to teach us about issues like the justification by faith and the rest. So obviously he's talking not only about an eternal judgment, but there's also, if you will, a social judgment that occurs when God gives a nation over to its sinful practices. When that's where, again, those very sobering four words, God gave them over. It's kind of like God says, okay, you want to run your life? You want to abandon biblical principles? I'm going to allow you to actually see the, unfortunately, natural consequences of disobeying biblical commands. And that's exactly what we find there as well. So if nothing else, as we wind down this particular section, then move on in the next segment to worldviews through history, notice that this progression really isn't just unique to the Hellenistic Greek world or the Hellenistic world of Rome that Apostle Paul was living in, because you have seen so often, and I think I've given you some good examples already, of the progression from idolatry to sexual perversion to anarchy to judgment, and that's found throughout history. And we see this perversion and this progression taking place in Greece. We see it in Persia. We see it in Babylon. We see it in Rome. Quite frankly, we see some aspects of that even in the nation of Israel. When the nation was turning its mind towards God in if you will, the Exodus, and then taking the land, there is a great deal of success. Later on, when there is the rebuilding of the wall in the temple, you see it again where they begin to come back to biblical ideas. But you also see times when they turn to their own, where everybody does what is right in their own eyes, and we see what that happens. And so if nothing else, I think we can see how this was a very natural progression described in the Hellenistic world. It's also something we see today in our own nation, and one of the reasons why we need to pray for a revival and reformation, because unless we return to God's principles, decline is inevitable. When we come back from the break, I want to talk a little bit about this booklet, Biblical Views on Worldviews Through History, which is something that kind of started this discussion, because it's intriguing that as you look at Rome and then you look at the rise of Christianity in Western culture, in many ways, our world today is a lot like the Roman Empire in the past. We'll talk about that right after these important messages.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let me spend just a few minutes on another book that we make available, and it's entitled A Biblical View on Worldviews Through History. Let me first of all give credit where credit is due. A lot of the material in this particular booklet comes from an individual that's been on this program, Glenn Sunshine, an individual that is a professor in Connecticut. I've had a chance to meet him. I've actually had a chance to preach in his church. He has been very much associated with Chuck Colson and Breakpoint Commentary. His book, Why You Think the Way You Do, The Story of Western Civilization or Western Worldviews from Rome to Home. It came out a number of years ago by Zondervan, and he makes a very good case for the fact that as we move through history, we see that in some respects the Roman Empire and the Roman worldview is replaced by Christianity. And now that we are removing Christianity from a lot of our culture, we're, in a sense, ending up with a worldview that's a lot like the Roman Empire. Back in the Roman Empire, you had this influence of Plato, what was called Neoplatonism. It was a religion, but it was also a philosophy, and it was the belief that there is, a difference between the physical and non-physical. And so this was a worldview that basically had a hierarchy. And because of that, then you had the spiritual, which was superior to the physical. And so as a result, this hierarchy was beginning to be implemented first in Greece and then in Rome, in which, for example, the father had superiority over all of the members of the family. This led to the idea that men are superior to women. It led to the idea that emperors should rule and be worshipped. It led to the idea that slaves were inferior. They weren't even really human beings. They were oftentimes described as living tools. And so in some respects, Rome was successful because of this, but it also had this very ugly underside, a glittering empire, he says, and a rotten core. Human life, of course, because of that, did not have much value. And as I've already alluded to, Romans engaged in all sorts of things. Slavery, of course, was the economic foundation of the empire. Abortion and infanticide oftentimes were regularly practiced. Roman families would usually keep as many healthy sons as they had and maybe only one daughter. The rest were discarded. And into this world came Christianity. First, Christians were very much persecuted. And then, as a result, even after that persecution, there was a time in which Christian ideas began to percolate through society. Christians, as I pointed out, really caused a different view because they were willing to rescue abandoned infants. They were willing to oftentimes minister to those affected by the plague, even at a risk of their own lives. They were willing to go and die in these places because they believed there was an afterlife. They believed in God. And the pagans said, I wouldn't be willing to die for this. And so as a result, Christianity began to eventually, after the centuries, began to dominate. And these Christian ideas began to move through the early parts even of the Middle Ages. And two individuals that really helped kind of formulate that were Augustine, writing The City of God and talking about the difference of the city of God and the city of man, and really focusing on and teaching the idea of love and charity and repentance. And then, of course, you also have a variety of other individuals. Aquinas fits into that category. And later on, even in the political realm, people like John Locke writing about these ideas of life, liberty, and property, which seem very important. The development of things like the Magna Carta. And so for a while, you really had this very strong emphasis upon a Christian world and life view. Of course, during the midst of that, you also had the Protestant Reformation. You have the Renaissance. But eventually, it moved into the Enlightenment. And after this, things began to be challenged. There were the beliefs in the past that there was a belief in absolute truth, that our human mind could know that absolute truth, that truth was necessary for society, and that really even that things like the Bible and Revelation would be a guide to determine what is right and what is wrong. But over time, because of some of the wars of the Reformation, people say, well, which Bible do you believe in? Which denomination do you believe in? There began to be a question that people were asking, is Christianity really true? Or which view of Christianity is true? With the discovery of the New World and whole people groups that had never heard the gospel, some people began to ask the question, would it be fair that God would send somebody to hell because they had never heard of Christianity? And so there began to be all sorts of challenges. The rise of science began to be a situation in which they began to say, well, maybe science can give us the answers that theology is not giving to us. And so we move eventually from enlightenment even into our modern world. And so there came to be kind of a rejection of spirituality. No longer was theology the queen of the sciences. Science became the queen of the sciences, if you will. And so as a result, there began to be a development of humanistic thought, Even later, a development of what you might call postmodernism, no longer a belief that anything is absolutely true. You have your view of truth, and I have my view of truth, and other people have a different view of truth. The rise of what's called neo-paganism came during that period of time, even things like the New Age movement. And in some respects, all of a sudden, you find yourself in the 21st century saying, this world that we live in today is a lot like the world of the first century. And I've oftentimes said that the 21st century is more like the first century than any century that followed it. And part of that was simply because if you take Western culture and you remove Christianity, you're really kind of back to Roman civilization. And so like Rome, we value toleration as the supreme virtue. Rome believed that toleration was important because it kept the empire together. If you go beyond the lines of what is considered toleration, you are persecuted, and certainly that is the case. The Romans lived in an oversexed society, and certainly a society that practiced abortion and infanticide. So do we. Our society does that as well. Rome was anti-natal eventually, as we pointed out. It began to have a declining birth rate. That is certainly one of the greatest challenges facing today, Western civilization, a society that is sort of collapsing because the birth rate is not even replacing the population. And as a result, sexual focus is the focus instead of trying to raise the next generation. And it all brings us back to kind of the key point. We, as a society, if we do not integrate Christian ideas back into society, will be a lot like Rome. And just as we talked about a few minutes ago, in terms of decline of a situation and a decline of society and a decline of civilization, we face some really significant challenges in the future. So I end my booklet by simply saying, so how should we live in this world? Well, first of all, we need to live out a biblical world and life view. Every generation is called to live faithfully to the gospel, and our generation is no exception. That is especially important today, I say, as we're facing a society that's not willing to accept biblical ideas. And in many ways, we're facing the same kind of challenges that we're facing the early church. So again, from history, we can see that the early church did live faithfully and transformed the Roman world, and Christians produced a new civilization, Western civilization and Western culture. So by living faithfully before this watching world, we'll increase our credibility, earn the respect from those around us by living in accordance with biblical principles. If you'd like to know a little bit more, of course, we have our biblical view of civilization decline, our biblical view on worldviews through history, and of course, they're always available through pointofview.net. That's all we have for this hour. I hope you've appreciated the look at civilization and worldviews right here on Point of View.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I've recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
If you listen to Point of View any length of time, you know that one of the things we talk about is the need to really look at America's godly heritage here in America. And we've had a number of guests over the years that have really addressed some of those issues. And today we're going to take that on, but also look at some of the things that we've heard if you go to a typical university. If you take a history class, you take a government class, you'll learn, for example, that all of the founders were deists. And so there really isn't much of a Christian heritage here. As you begin to study the Constitution, you'll learn that we have a godless Constitution, and that the First Amendment was really to separate the institutions of church and state, and that Madison and others were very concerned about the church getting involved in public policy. And if you hear that, you're going to really want to pay attention to this interview, because number one, every one of those things is false, and we're going to try to demonstrate those. Number two, you may want to pass this on to young people that have been hearing a lot of that at major universities. So we are privileged to have in the studio with us today Dr. Mark David Hall. He has been a professor at George Fox University since 2001, has a bachelor's degree in political science from Wheaton College, also a PhD in government from the University of Virginia. He's the director of the John Dickinson Forum on the Study of American Founding Principles. He has actually worked with groups like Alliance Defending Freedom. Matter of fact, you might remember the case of Barronelle Stutzman we've talked about on the program, and actually dealt with some of those issues as well. Also associated with the faculty of the Center for the Study of Law and Religion at Emory University, as well as a senior fellow at Baylor University's Institute for Studies of Religion, and also an affiliate scholar at the John Jay Institute. And that, if nothing else, shows the incredible credibility that you bring to this conversation. So, Dr. Hall, it's just great to have you in studio with us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Kirby.
Let's, if we can, maybe spend some time talking about how this book developed. The book, which we have on our website so people can order it, it's published by Thomas Nelson, Did America Have a Christian Founding? But it really goes back to the Heritage Foundation. I think Matthew Spalding had you give a message. I've seen the message. And it started the genesis of this whole book, didn't it?
That's exactly right. He invited me to give a lecture, and we were pleasantly surprised when C-SPAN showed up to cover it. So we didn't know that was going to happen. And I then wrote it up and published it as an essay, and we learned that the essay had been downloaded over 300,000 times. And I was able to use these facts to help get a contract for this, my first book aimed at the general reading public. But I think the interest of C-SPAN, the interest in this essay, and hopefully the interest in this book just shows that Americans have a long and abiding interest in this question about the role of Christianity in the American founding.
And I think a lot of them just get the sense that what we are being taught in public broadcasting, what our kids are being taught in the university is not right. And I might just mention the praise that you receive for this book comes, well, the first person there, Kelly Shackelford. Every listener knows that because he's here almost every Friday with us talking about some of the things at First Liberty. Second one, Luke Gundrich. He was just on the other day as we talked about his book. Peter Littleback. Think of the number of times we've had him on. Marvin Olasky, Roy Peterson. I can go through the long list of individuals that are part of those that have endorsed this book, including Daniel Dreisbach, who you've co-authored quite a number of books with. And so this really started with an attempt to try to answer these questions. And so there's really kind of 5 chapters, so I thought I'd take each one of them kind of face to face. And the first one I've already alluded to. The founders were a bunch of deists. Now, my argument sometimes when I only have a moment, if I'm in a university classroom or in a debate, is, well, if they were deists, boy, they sure were pious deists, because we have sometimes recorded where these individuals were praying for hours. They're a little bit different kind of deists than I've ever met. But talk about this idea, because it's trying to say that, okay, they did refer to God or divine principle or providence, but they really weren't anything like you and me as an evangelical Christian, right?
That's exactly right. So I begin each chapter with about 20 quotations from prominent scholars or popular authors who say things like most of America's founders were deists. And I do that to make it clear that I'm not attacking a straw man. These are ideas that are prevalent in the academy, in public schools, and even in many private schools. And so what I do then in this chapter, the first substantive chapter, is I look into this myth, by which I mean a false story. And basically everyone who makes this argument works the exact same way. They focus on 6 or 7 founders, the 4 who became president, Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Ben Franklin, and Alexander Hamilton, then maybe 1 or 2 additional favorites, Tom Paine and Ethan Allen, something like that. And one of the things I do is I go through and I ask, okay, what evidence is there that these folks are not Orthodox Christians? And that doesn't say they're deists, but it is an important question to ask. And we find for sure that Franklin, Jefferson, and Adams are not Orthodox Christians. But that's not the same thing as being a deist. But before I get to the deist part, I'll point out that when it comes to a Washington, a Madison, a Hamilton, there actually is no record that they abandoned any basic tenet of basic Christianity, Apostles' Creed sort of Christianity. And then when we turn to deist, if I ask almost anyone for a definition of a deist, they'll say, well, a creator God who creates a world and then steps away from it. Well, if this is their definition of deist, then my opponents are in a lot of trouble, because someone like George Washington references providence more than 270 times. He talks about God protecting him individually, God protecting the nation, and really all these founders do it. Now, it is almost certainly the case that a Tom Paine does it simply for rhetorical reasons, and I would even concede that might be the case for Jefferson, but I'm just not sure it's all the case for the rest of them. So really we're down to 1 or 2 founders who are reasonably called deists, and we haven't even touched the rest of the founding generation, for which there's even less evidence.
Well, let's talk about that, because if indeed deism means that God started the universe and walked away, and which was kind of the default value, because they couldn't say they were atheists until maybe later when you got Charles Darwin or something like that, then if they really believe that God steps away, then let's take the obvious deist, Benjamin Franklin, who says that a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without God knowing it. So again, he goes on to argue for why there should be prayer for the nation. Well, why would you pray if you are convinced that God has walked away and we're all on our own, right?
That's exactly right. And of course, this is a speech he gave in the Constitutional Convention. And what's interesting about Franklin, as a young man, he writes in his autobiography that he came under the spell of the deist. But then he also says in his own autobiography, I quickly recognized this was a dangerous doctrine. If we fast forward to the speech he just referenced, he goes on to say, the longer I live, the more I'm convinced that God governs the affairs of men. And why should this surprise us? Have we all not known people who are maybe skeptical in their youth and then who have gravitated towards a more orthodox form of Christianity? And I think by the end of his life, Franklin clearly believed that God intervenes in the affairs of men and nations and therefore is not a deist.
I might just mention this first article that is in there, which is now the first chapter. In the end, it also recommends a number of different books, one of which I got right here, Reading the Bible with the Founding Fathers by Dreisbach. Of course, he's also written about the whole issue of separation of church and state and what that really means. And of course, you have co-authored most of those books with him. And then Thomas Kidd's been on the program with us, The God of Liberty, and then Carl Richards. So you give us some other books. So if people say, well, okay, I know that you have really good credentials, and I know you've co-authored some really good academic books, But I'd like to read what some other people have to say. You give us some things to read as well. And so this is the kind of book I really would want to put in the hands of any young person that has taken a class in history or government at a major university so that they get the other side. So when we come back, I'm going to keep moving because we have 5 chapters and we want to try to cover all 5. So when we come back, we're going to ask this question: does the United States have a godless constitution? There's a book written about that a number of years ago, and so he takes that issue on right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
I had Professor Robert George of Princeton University on my radio program recently to talk about the dialogue he had for a number of years with Professor Cornel West. They certainly qualify as the odd couple given their differences in political perspectives and their different racial backgrounds, but they have forged a partnership based upon mutual respect and a desire for civil dialogue. Months ago, they published an op-ed that was really a summary of their common commitments. They reminded us that to unite the country, we need honesty and courage. And here are 4 of their many aphorisms in that article. First, they said we need the honesty and courage to speak the truth, including painful truths that unsettle not only our foes, but also our friends and most especially ourselves. Number 2, we need the honesty and courage to recognize the faults, flaws, and failings of even the greatest of our heroes and to acknowledge our own faults, flaws, and failings. Number 3, we need the honesty and courage to express dissent, to say, no, I will not go along when conscience tells us that our own ideological or political tribe has gone astray, or gone too far, or become fanatical, or blind to integrity and the dignity of all. And number 4, we need the honesty and courage not to compromise our beliefs, or to go silent on them out of a desire to be accepted, or out of a fear of being ostracized, excluded, or canceled. You know, America is a divided country, and we need to work to end this polarization. That's why I think these wise statements provide a foundation to do just that. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, we are privileged to have in studio with us today Dr. Mark David Hall, and again, a professor at George Fox, but also is involved with the Center for Study of Law and Religion at Emory, a senior fellow at Baylor University's Institute for Studies of Religion, and also an affiliate scholar of the John Jay Institute, to mention just a few places. And he's been traveling around on this book, which really came from a speech that you gave at the Heritage Foundation. Let's take on one of these books that probably should never have been written, but it is out there, and it's amazing how many times young people believe it because it argues that the United States has a godless constitution. I read the Constitution. I don't see God in there, so it must be a godless constitution. There are, I think, better answers to that. How do you respond?
That's exactly right. So I think you're referring to the book by Kramnik and Moore, 2 Cornell professors who wrote a book called The Godless Constitution. But they're far from the only professors that argue this sort of thing.
Right.
And I give, again, another 24 quotations or so to this effect. Well, the obvious point they have to make is that the deity is not really mentioned in the Constitution. not to get to the date line in the year of our Lord, 1787. But I certainly wouldn't want to place too much weight on a date line. Now, if that's all they had to say, they could make their argument in a sentence rather than a book, but they do have more to say. They go on to argue that most of America's founders were deists, something that I think is demonstrably false. They also then go on to say that America's founders were influenced by secular Enlightenment ideas. And here, I'm very happy to debate them because that's exactly how I approach the Christian founding. That is, I argue in terms of the influence of Christian ideas. And so I would suggest, and I argue in the book in detail, that America's founders were profoundly influenced by Christian ideas. Not necessarily uniquely Christian ideas, but ideas they came to because they were Christians. So the sinfulness of man, the fact that humans are created in the imago Dei, the image of God, and therefore should be treated with dignity and respect, their understanding of liberty, and so on. And we can maybe flesh that out if you'd like, but I think in very substantive ways, these ideas informed America's founders when they created our constitutional order.
Sure. One of the books I have here is by one of my professors at Georgetown, where we were required to read the Federalist Papers with the same kind of detail that you would exegete the New Testament in a seminary class. And when you did that, you began to realize, let me just take James Madison, so we'll pick up him a little bit later in just a few minutes. Federalist Paper number 10, Federalist Paper number 51, you get the sense that he studied under a man by the name of John Witherspoon. He believed in human sinfulness. He believed that men were not angels. If men were angels, then we wouldn't need government. But we do need a government because, indeed, he wanted to have various ambitious individuals and have checks and balances and have ambition rivaling ambition. That is a Christian view. That is not an Enlightenment view that says men are basically good. That's a view that says we might have individuals that are in government that are potentially corruptible, that will be ambitious, and we need to have checks and balances, and that's very much a Christian idea, isn't it?
I think that's a wonderful example, and I would add to what you said, all of which was correct. He was educated as a young man by a Presbyterian minister, Robertson, about whom he later said, all that I have done in life I owe to this man. Now, Madison, as an adult, is intensely private about his religious beliefs, but I think he indisputably absorbed this Calvinist view of human nature, that humans are sinful and even Christians continue to struggle with the old man within. And so, therefore, when we're building a national government, we must avoid concentrated power. So we have federalism, separation of powers, checks and balances. And you're exactly right. Many Enlightenment thinkers at the time are going in exactly the opposite direction. Humans are basically good. They're perfectible. We need a strong national government run by the experts that can fix the problems with the hoi polloi out there.
Yeah.
And America's founders, as I said, went in exactly the opposite direction because of their Christian convictions with respect to human nature.
Where did some of these ideas come from? Because one of the individuals that you quote here, we've read him as well, and looks at the fact that when you go back and look at the writings of the early founders, so often they were quoting from the sermons of some of these professors and some of these pastors. And so a lot of these ideas really were preached from the pulpits, weren't they, of the in New England and all up and down the eastern and seaboard, weren't they?
Absolutely. And I know you've written on this as well. The preachers were oftentimes the most educated person in a community. They would give 2 long exegetical sermons on a Sunday, an additional message on a Thursday night. Very influential, and they did not hesitate to speak out on political matters. In New England, they would oftentimes be invited annually to address the legislatures. And again, they would teach a Christian and really even a Calvinist view of politics, enormously influential. When we turn from the preachers to the civic leaders, what we see is that they are quoting the Bible routinely, far more than the Enlightenment text or any other text. And in fact, those scholars that have looked into this actually undercount references to the Bible because they routinely would simply quote the Bible without putting in the little parenthetical citation, Psalm 139:5, Micah 4:4, Micah 6:8, that the founders, all of them, used the scripture all the time in their political arguments.
Which is kind of interesting because they so knew the scriptures that they sometimes didn't give the Bible reference because they knew everybody would know what they were. And then you get these secular historians now in the 21st century who don't know the Bible, and they go, well, that's an interesting quote. I don't know where it came from. And you get what you get. Well, I'm going to keep the train moving down the road because you've got some great chapters, and one of those is chapter 3, which I know that Kelly Shackelford appreciated the most. Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and the First Amendment. Now, when you go to Thomas Jefferson, they make a big deal about a letter that he wrote to the Danbury Baptist Association, and that's kind of where this idea of wall of separation came from. Can you give us some history on that?
In the American context, that's absolutely correct. So in 1802, Thomas Jefferson writes a letter to the Danbury Baptist, some of the few Baptists in New England. And in this letter, he writes that the First Amendment, the Establishment Clause, specifically creates a wall of separation between church and state. In 1947, the U.S. Supreme Court latches onto this as a defining metaphor for explaining the Establishment Clause. And it's just nonsensical for all sorts of reasons. The first and most obvious is that Jefferson did not help write the First Amendment. He did not help ratify the First Amendment. We have no evidence that the First Federal Congress was looking to him for any sort of influence or guidance. Secondly, even with respect to both Madison and Jefferson, it's not clear that this metaphor reflects what they did in their political lives. It might be what Jefferson desired in the interior of his mind, but as president, he did not act like this at all. And if I can tell just one of my favorite stories, 2 days after he penned this letter, he went to church services in the U.S. Capitol building, where he heard John Leland, the great Baptist itinerant minister, and himself an opponent of religious establishments, preach. Now, this does not seem to be the sort of thing a president committed to a wall of separation between church and state would do. And I'll just add that Jefferson, on his own authority, made the War Department building and the Treasury Department building available for church services on Sunday. And I give plenty of examples like that.
Well, let's talk about that for just another minute before we take a break. And that is, when you talk about this, the largest church in America at one time was in the U.S. Capitol. And I think our atheist friends sort of want to ignore that, because when they say, well, you can't have religion in the political arena, they used a political institution, a political building, they would say, for actually a church service on Sunday, didn't they?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And that went on as early as Washington, D.C. got going as our nation's capital, and it continued well into the 19th century. And there are plenty of other examples like this. And even Jefferson, when he went back to Charlottesville, he would worship regularly in the town hall that would be used for religious services. Jefferson, when he designed the national seal, had basically Moses extending his hand over the Red Sea with the soldiers of Pharaoh and their chariots following the Israelites and being swallowed in the Red Sea. And his motto for the United States of America would have been, rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God. Mm-hmm. And we could go on and on. And keep in mind, we're talking about Jefferson, who wanted a greater degree of separation than almost any other founder. When we turn from Jefferson and Madison to the rest of the founding generation, there's utterly no evidence that America's founders desired to build a wall of separation between church and state.
Well, we've talked about Jefferson. In a minute, we're going to talk about Madison, but we're coming to one of those mandatory breaks. So when we come back, we'll finish that chapter, which is a very good chapter on the whole issue of the First Amendment. It's the third chapter. We have a couple more to go. But let me just mention as we're going to the break that if you would like to get a copy of this book, you should be able to find it in your local bookstore, because Thomas Nelson's done a pretty good job of getting that information out there. But if you would like to get a copy of it, you can get it in hardback, Kindle, and I understand eventually be an audiobook. So that's going to be really good. So again, if you would like to get this might be something to get as a present, especially for those young people that maybe have only heard one side and need to hear the other side. And if you would like to read this, although Mark David Hall is a very scholarly individual, he has written this in a way that is quite readable. So this is really for the lay audience. So if you find yourself saying, okay, he's a pretty smart guy, can I understand this? Yes, you'll find this fascinating. And he tells you some great stories, gives you footnotes, gives you suggested reading. Matter of fact, the endnotes go on for pages. So if you say, wait a minute, I need to read that for myself, it's all in this book as well. About 200 pages, and if you'd like to find it in your local bookstore, perhaps you will, but if not, we've made it very easy for you to get a copy of it here by going to pointofview.net. We come back, I'm also going to talk about what's on his website, because there's other articles. There's a place for you to contact him. Maybe you'd like to have him come sometime and speak to your civic group, your church, maybe even speak at the university or something like that. That is an opportunity as well. But we're going to take a break, and we'll continue talking about Did America Have a Christian Founding with Mark David Hall right after these important messages.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests, by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is at Point of View RTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, at Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kirby Anderson.
Privileged to have in studio with us for a little bit longer David Hall. Mark David Hall, an individual that teaches at George Fox University. And so if you would like to know more about him, we have a link on our website to georgefox.edu, and you can find out about that. Also, the John Dickinson Forum on the Study of American Founding Principles. We also have, if you have noticed here, as we have shown his picture up there, also a link to his Facebook page and his Twitter feed, and also, of course, the website. So there's a lot of ways for people to contact you. And I think if people would like to have you come and speak at a university, at a civics group, or maybe at their church, you're available, aren't you?
I'd be happy to do it. Yes, sir.
And again, the book is entitled, Did America Have a Christian Founding? And for just a minute, we were in the middle of chapter 3. So we talk about Jefferson's Wall. Can we talk about Madison's Lines? Because that's one of your talks, if I remember right. Jefferson's Walls, Madison's Lines, right?
Sure. So Jefferson had his metaphor, the wall of separation between church and state. James Madison, later in life, in responding to a letter or a sermon, actually from Jasper Adams, used the metaphor of a line of separation between church and state, which, as you might imagine, separationists don't like quite as much, because the line's not as imposing as a wall. But even with respect to Madison, again, he and Jefferson wanted a greater degree of separation between church and state than most founders. But even he, as a member of the Confederation Congress, voted to pay congressional chaplains. In the first federal Congress, he was on the committee that decided the House would have its own chaplain, the Senate would have its own chaplain, the military would have chaplains, that these chaplains would be paid, and on you go. So when it comes to Madison, it really isn't until he leaves the presidency in a private document that was unpublished in his lifetime and really not known until the 20th century, a document known as the Attached Memorandum. We're sort of reflecting on life. He said, well, maybe as president, I shouldn't have issued calls for prayer and fasting, even though he issued 4 of them. Maybe we shouldn't have paid legislative chaplains and so forth. And, that's interesting. Maybe he changed his mind. Maybe he always held those views, but he didn't act on them. And when did we turn from Jefferson and Madison to the rest of the founding generation, as I've suggested already? Any evidence that they desired to build a wall of separation between church and state just utterly evaporates.
Yeah, Justice Hugo Black and some others pull this idea of the wall metaphor, and it becomes constitutional. It's just silly. But nevertheless, you really answer some of those questions about Jefferson's Wall and Madison's Line. But I thought we'd pick out just a couple of others. And one of those, chapter 4, the founders believe civic authority should protect, promote, and encourage religion and morality. But what we sometimes hear from people is, well, I don't know, we have these religious tests, in various states, and we even have there should be no religious test for office. So what does that mean, and how do we try to sort through some of those kinds of ideas?
Sure. Well, in 1787, 11 of the 13 states had religious tests for office. Virginia and New York did not.
Yes.
But don't get excited if you're from New York, because in 1788, they adopted a religious test to keep Roman Catholics from holding office. Now, I don't necessarily think, in fact, I'll say I don't think these are a good thing.
No.
And I think it's very nice that when we created the U.S. Constitution, Article 6 bans religious tests for office, but the states could still have them. But the states, I think, appropriately moved away from them, as well they should. But it's one thing to say we aren't going to have an official state religious test for office, and another thing to say that voters shouldn't take into account the religious convictions of would-be state officials or federal officials when they cast their ballots. And it certainly is appropriate to bring one's religion into the public square. One of the documents I quote that I really love, and I can only paraphrase it here, but in 1780, Pennsylvania passed a Gradual Manumission Act, that is an act to end slavery over time. And they explicitly appealed to the Bible. They said, we understand that liberty is a gift from God, and it's unjust to deny this liberty to our brothers and sisters who are African Americans. And so therefore, ... slavery is put on the road to extinction. And if we can run with that line, of course, the abolitionist movement is driven by Christianity, and slavery is ended, but we still have Jim Crow legislation. But fortunately, the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., the Reverend Ralph Abernathy, and others led the civil rights movement, again, drawing on their Christian convictions to say these laws are immoral, they're unjust, they must be repealed. In America, its founders would have said amen. Now, some of them, hadn't arrived at that position in the 18th century, obviously, but one hopes they would. And I think you and I as Christians today could say, thank God for those great men of faith who brought their religious convictions into the public square.
And again, when you think about this, preceding the American Revolution was the First Great Awakening. And so that was so significant after the American Revolution. And then we move into, of course, the 19th century. We had the Second Great Awakening. And you have, as you point out, religious ideas were instrumental in not only the abolition movement, but the temperance movement, the suffrage movement, the child labor movement, eventually, even as you point out, by the time you get to the 1960s, the civil rights movement. So to have this idea, to coin a term from somebody I used to interact with when I was in Washington, D.C., Richard John Newhouse, that we don't want a naked public square. We didn't necessarily want a sacred public square. We were always enforcing values, and so some of these religious tests might have been too over the top. But we wanted an open public square, and the idea of cultivating civic virtue, of even having, for example, the idea of "so help me God," and all sorts of other things that are part of this. There was just a real attempt on the part of not only the framers, but many of the individuals in not only the 18th, 19th, and even 20th century to recognize that religion was important and religious ideas were important to bring about good in the midst of some of the evil taking place in society.
You know, that's absolutely right. I reference what Jim Hudson in the Library of Congress calls the founder syllogism. Just literally everyone believed this. If you want a Republican form of government, you have to have a moral people. If you want to have a moral people, you have to have a religious people. And they did use the term religion, but in this context, they clearly and indisputably meant Christianity. So if we want a Christian people, what should the government do? Fortunately, from my perspective, many founders would come to the conclusion that we need to get government out of the business of running churches, and that will lead to true Christianity flourishing. And so you sort of pointed toward this already. There is a movement away from having official established churches at the state level. Now, a lot of secular historians and others would say that's because the founders were Enlightenment rationalists. That's nonsense. If you look at the debates in the state-by-state level, the main arguments were we need to get the state out of the business of religion because we want Christianity to flourish.
It seems to me, too, that some of the founders said really the Constitution was made for moral and religious individuals. We have the current Attorney General that has talked about the fact that if you wanted virtue and discipline, then religion is important. Michael Novak and a variety of others have said the same. And if you think about this, Mark, for just a minute, we're talking about if indeed you have kind of this idea of civic virtue, of people have kind of their own self-government and they're doing the right thing, then you don't need a huge government because, after all, if indeed everybody does what is right in their own eyes, if I can paraphrase the Bible, then you have anarchy, and then you almost have to have a policeman on every street corner to keep people from doing wrong. But if you have people doing moral things and motivated by religious values, they're going to be doing the right thing whether the police officer is looking or not. Fair?
I think that's exactly right. One of my favorite discussions here is the founder's understanding of liberty. Today, even my Christian college students think of liberty in John Stuart Mill's terms, basically the freedom to do anything you want except for physically harm someone else. America's founders, most of them would have been befuddled by that sort of definition of liberty. They distinguish between liberty and licentiousness. Liberty is a freedom to do what is right. So to say to the American founders, you have a liberty to curse in public, you have a liberty to print pornography, they would have just thought is ridiculous. They would have rejected that altogether. So I think you're exactly right. You have to have Christianity in order to have a moral citizenry, and with this moral citizenry then comes a self-restraint, a treating others with respect, telling the truth in public discourse, and we can have a functioning republic. Without those things, we're in trouble.
Well, let's take a break, and when we come back, since we're talking about liberty, the last chapter is Christianity, religious liberty, and religious exemptions. And so we're going to spend just a few minutes talking about that. And if you find yourself saying, this looks like a really good book, I'd like to know more about it. Chapter 1, which we talked about, the myth of the founders' deism. Chapter 2, United States does not have a godless constitution. Chapter 3, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and the First Amendment. Chapter 4, the founders believe civic authorities should protect, promote, and encourage religion and morality. And Chapter 5, which we'll look at after the break, Christianity, religious liberty, and religious exemptions. And it is a very readable book, about 200 pages. It is published by Thomas Nelson. You should be able to find it in your local bookstore, but if not, we have a link there so you can get it in hardback or Kindle. And I just think it is the kind of book that you would enjoy reading. And it's one that you really need to put in the hands of some young people who have maybe just been hearing only one side. This attempts to answer those questions. And then I was just looking at the number of endnotes. If somebody says, wait a minute, where did you get that? The endnotes go on for page after page after page. Looks like about almost 40 pages of endnotes. This is a scholar I'm sitting across from. So that will help you find some of those things and come to those conclusions on your own. So when we come back, we'll spend a little more time looking at that last chapter. Did America have a Christian founding? Mark David Hall with us, and we will continue our conversation with him right after these important messages.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes as we talk about this book, Did America Have a Christian Founding? Mark David Hall. And again, we want to talk about the 5th chapter briefly, Christianity, Religious Liberty, and Religious Exemptions. And, of course, this whole idea of religious liberty has changed dramatically, because there was a time not so long ago when if somebody was working on religious liberty, they were seen as almost like a civil rights lawyer. Now today they're saying, well, that religious liberty, it's just anti-LGBT kind of stuff. But if you go back to our founding, the framers, first of all the founders, then later the framers, recognized we need to have some area of liberty here. We don't need a state-run church. We don't want the ecclesiastical elements to get involved in politics. So we want to keep the institutions separate, but we want people to have freedom. We don't want it to turn out the way it did in Europe and in the in England. And so they really argued rather strenuously for this idea of religious liberty. And today, that's certainly one of the biggest issues under attack, isn't it?
I think that's exactly right. And we don't want to tell too optimistic of a story. So in the early American colonies, they had religious liberty, but it's not as robust as we would have liked. Quakers and Jesuits are banned from some of the colonies. By the time you get to the late 18th century, though, I think there is a consensus that this right to worship God according to the dictates of conscience, to act upon your religion, is very, very important, and it must be protected whenever possible. Now, of course, religious liberty is not a trump card that wins in every case. We aren't going to allow an Aztec to sacrifice a baby to the sun god. But really, by the late 18th century, they recognized that the state shouldn't be compelling in matters of faith. I think it's important to note that then, as now, really the real main threat to religious liberty are general, neutrally applicable laws that are not aimed at religion per se, but they nonetheless keep people from acting upon their religious convictions. The founders were aware of these sorts of problems, especially with Quakers. Quakers, as you know, members of the Society of Friends, they're religious pacifists. Well, what are we going to do with respect to military service when colonies and then states had laws requiring everyone to serve? Well, we could throw them in jail if they don't serve, or we could eliminate the laws saying everyone has to do this. What Americans did, and I think this is the best solution, is they came up with religious exemptions or accommodations to say, okay, look, everyone has to serve, but if you're a religious pacifist, we will permit you to serve in a different way, or maybe to hire a substitute. Quakers also don't swear oaths, they'll affirm oaths. And I give that as an example because I think it's telling the U.S. Constitution itself has a religious accommodation. The Article 2 oath of office for the president permits the president to swear or affirm this oath, a provision clearly aimed at Quakers and Mennonites and Brethren and others with objections to swearing of oaths.
Yes. And again, you talk about the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which I think only was implemented because this is one of those few times I might disagree with Antonin Scalia, that in the so-called Smith decision, they went too far. And that has to do with this idea of free exercise. On the one hand, you have the establishment of religion, and we've had Kelly Shackelford on this program talking about how, in some respects, it seems like the Supreme Court wants to set aside the so-called Lemon test that has been so restrictive on the establishment of religion. But now he also is working to maybe try to eliminate the Smith decision and say that we should have free exercise. And so we don't want to establish religion. We don't want to force somebody to do something against their will religiously. But on the other hand, when there is no compelling interest on the part of the government, no overwhelming reason, we should have religious liberty. And that kind of looks like what the founders intended in the first place, isn't it?
I think so. I think you can argue that our understanding of religious liberty developed, but by the time you get to the 1960s, there's a sense that it's very important, it must be protected. The liberal justice, William Brennan, came up with this Sherbert test that basically required the government to have a compelling interest before it overrides someone's ability to act on their religious convictions. This was overturned in Oregon versus Smith in an opinion written by Scalia. And like you, I love Scalia. I don't like this opinion. But what it's telling to me, Kirby, is Congress acted almost immediately, 97-3 in the Senate, unanimously in the House, passed the law, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, signed into law by President Bill Clinton. And this shows that even in the 1990s, there's this consensus that religious liberty is really, really important. Now, what's distressing to me, and I'm sure it is to you and Kelly, is when we get to the 21st century, all of a sudden now we're having academics write books like Why Tolerate Religion? And is religion special? We have a president who speaks routinely of the freedom of worship. That is President Obama, and his administration routinely spoke in this way. Worship is fine, but the ability of the Green family to operate Hobby Lobby according to their religious convictions, the ability of a Barronelle Stutzman, the florist in Washington, to operate her business according to her religious convictions, they're out of luck because that isn't worship, and so therefore it's not protected. So we've seen these assaults on religious liberty over the last decade and a half, and it's very troubling to me. And
one of the books you recommend is one that we've done an interview on with Mary Eberstadt. It's Dangerous to Believe. And there are many others, of course, all the things that Kelly has shared, as well as our friends with Alliance Defending Freedom and a variety of other groups that we all encourage you to support. And it is becoming kind of a big question here in the 21st century, Mark, that we do find a situation in which some people are saying, if I'm a Christian that have Christian convictions, can I be a baker? Can I be a florist? Can I be a photographer? Can I be a student on a university campus? Can I be an innkeeper? Can I be a T-shirt printer? And so far, most of those decisions are, I believe, going the right direction, but some of them are taking a long, long time to get there. Because if we go back to our founding and understand what the framers intended, and what I think most Americans even believe today, kind of a live and let live, I may disagree with what you might want to allow somebody to print on a T-shirt, but I don't want to force you to print something you would disagree with. And a good example is this T-shirt printer in Kentucky who's won almost every one of these cases, who's even had a friend of the court brief coming from a lesbian in New Jersey who's also a T-shirt printer saying, look, I don't want to be forced either. And so the point about a lot of this on religious liberty is if you lose religious liberty, you, even as an atheist, have to pay attention to this, because if Christians lose their religious liberty, sooner or later, you're going to lose your liberty as well.
You know, I think that's exactly right. And I hope this book does a number of things. But if I could choose just one thing, it would be to remind my fellow Americans of the importance of religious liberty, and religious liberty for all, not just for Christians, for Jews, for Muslims and Sikhs. And I suggest a few practical steps. I know we're all busy, working jobs, sharing the gospel, working in soup kitchens, but we just have to make time for politics. We need to be informed. We need to cast intelligent ballots. And I specifically encourage your listeners, if they have the funds available, to support groups like First Liberty, Alliance Defending Freedom, the Beckett Fund. These folks are on the front lines every day doing great work, and they're worthy of our support.
And one of the reasons we put them on the program on a regular basis is because we believe in those individuals, almost all of whom have endorsed your book. So if nothing else, you're a fellow traveler with them. Well, one last time, let me just mention the book again. Did America Have a Christian Founding? And this is just an excellent book, Mark David Hall, and it is one that you can probably find in your local bookstore. But if not, we certainly have information, first of all, about the book. So you can get it in hardback or in Kindle. If you'd like to contact Mark David Hall, we have all his links there. You have the Facebook page, we have the Twitter feed, we have his web page. And so I would encourage you maybe to consider not only getting the book, but maybe having him come and speak for your group sometime, or at ordering the book and having him sign it. So that would be something else as well. But I've appreciated your work. I've known about you. I've seen you co-author some books with Daniel Dreisbeck, who's been on the program, but it's been an honor to have you in the studio with us today.
It's been a real pleasure being here, Kirby. Thank you.
Again, one last time, the book is entitled, Did America Have a Christian Founding? And if you find yourself saying, well, I'd like to know a little bit more, we have information about that on the website, pointofview.net. But let me give you one other assignment. This particular interview is available on podcast. You can go to our website and click on the listen, and you could send it to someone, maybe a young person you know in college. Or maybe you would like to watch it since he's in studio. You can hit the watch button, or you can go to the YouTube channel and send it to someone. And if you had not already seen what he did at the Heritage Foundation, this is kind of a give and take on the book. I would encourage you to send that to some others who need to know about this as well. So if nothing else, we wanted to provide that opportunity on our website, pointofview.net. First of all, I want to thank Doug for his help in engineering. I want to thank Steve for his help in the area of producing. Hope you had a great day. We'll see you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
When you give to Point of View, does it make a difference? Jeremy Dies would tell you that it does. He grew up listening to Point of View in the back seat of his mom's car, and it helped to shape his thinking.
I had parents that were able to sit across from me at the dinner table after we listened to Marlon Maddox and Kirby Anderson years ago and think through what the scriptures say about these issues of current significance in our lives. That's only possible because Point of View has come along and ministered into my life and made me who I am today. And here I am today defending religious liberty, partly because Marlon Maddox and Penn Dexter and Kirby Anderson were the ones that were pushing me towards all that. They taught me how to think through these issues. They didn't tell me what to think. They taught me how to think.
Each gift you give will change lives. Not every Point of View listener will become a Jeremy, but if they listen for very long, they will be changed. And that will change how they impact and affect the lives of the people around them. So make that decision to change a life today. Join the Truth Team and boldly stand for truth in a world of lies, distortion, and information manipulation. Go to pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View